All right. I'd like to welcome you all to the fall semester book talk of GLODEM's Book Club. Today we have the great pleasure of hosting Professor Şener Aktürk with us. Before I give the floor to him to present his book, I'll read his biography out loud. Şener Aktürk is a professor in the Department of International Relations at Koç University. He is a scholar of comparative politics with a focus on comparative politics of ethnicity, religion, and nationalism. After completing his BA and MA at the University of Chicago and his PhD in political science at the University of California at Berkeley, he was a postdoctoral fellow at the Davis Center for Russian and Eurasian Studies and a visiting lecturer at the Department of Government at Harvard University. His book, Regimes of Ethnicity and Nationhood in Germany, Russia, and Turkey, which was published by Cambridge University Press, received the 2013 Joseph Rothschild Prize from the Association for the Study of Nationality. His articles were published in World Politics, Perspectives on Politics, Comparative Politics, Journal of Ethnic and Migration Studies, Post-Soviet Affairs, Mediterranean Politics, Social Science Quarterly, European Journal of Sociology, Nationalities, Papers, Problems of Post-Communism, Turkish Studies, Middle Eastern Studies, among others, because that's a really long list of a lot of really prestigious journals. And he is also the recipient of the Peter Odegaard Award, a Marie Curie International Reintegration Grant, and Baki Komşuoğlu Social Sciences Encouragement Award, together with Kadir Has Social Sciences Prize, Tuba Young Scientist Award, Baguette Science Academy Award, and Vitak Incentive Prize, among others. Again, a long list of prizes as well. So without further ado, I'll give the floor to Professor Aktürk. Thank you so very much for being with us today.
Well, Melih Hocam, thank you very much for this invitation. When I received this invitation to present our collaborative work on the Arab Spring in its anniversary, I was very excited, not only because it's kind of our home turf here, and to share our work with our colleagues and students in the same corridor and the same building and the same floor is comforting. But I also want to thank above all to all 12 international authors, I see at least one of them in the Zoom call, who made this collaborative effort possible. And they know, and I know, that it hasn't been easy in many ways, and yet it is completed and published and open access and available to everyone in English. What I could not possibly anticipate during the publication process and the original book launch we had in late May at Marmara University was that this particular book talk would coincide with such a historic turning point for the Arab Spring, almost certainly the most important turning point of the last 11 years, what has transpired in the last 2.5 weeks, which in addition is in so many ways vindicating and confirming the main arguments we had in the book, and which many people thought were overly optimistic and unrealistic, right? And that's actually the frame and the structure of the talk, as we've discussed with Mary Hoca, is that I'm going to have a somewhat short, somewhat long presentation based on my concluding chapter, The Arab Spring as a World Historic Event, where I go over 7-8 main lessons that I draw from co-editing this work and contributing several of its chapters, the one on Syria, as well as the concluding chapter on the spring. And then we are going to open up some of these themes in a Q&A session with Mary Hoca, maybe 15 to 20 minutes. So that's going to take us to basically almost 3:20. And then we are going to have a Q&A session, 40 minutes ideally, at least. and then we have to evacuate this room immediately. And hopefully we will be there. We will be here until 4 o'clock, right? I mean, so I want to start with the really broad overview, which then will take us to the last 2-3 weeks, right? Tomorrow is the 14th anniversary of the Arab Spring. Originally, we wanted to do it on December 17th, but it's my 15th year at Koç University, so they were going to organize the ceremony for tomorrow. They rescheduled it, but we rescheduled the book talk, so now it's 14 years minus 1. So tomorrow is the 14th anniversary of the Arab Spring, when Mohammed Bouazi set himself on fire in Tunisia upon the confiscation of his, he was a vendor, street vendor, and that sparked the protest wave in December 17, 2010. And the first 2.5 years, I think of it as a pendulum. You are all familiar with the pendulum, right? And that's actually very good for understanding many of the comparative revolutions in world history, revolutionary waves and protest waves. That pendulum swing from December 17, 2010 swings at least for about 2.5 years, when one after the other, 3 and eventually 4, but originally 3 North African autocratic regimes collapsed, their leaders depart, and then it actually moves all the way into the Arabian Peninsula beyond North Africa until about July 2013 for sure, because that's another critical turning point, probably the most critical and the most negative for the course of the Arab Spring, because what happens in July 2nd, 2013 is the military coup in Egypt, right? So, and that's the most populous central Arab state with the overthrow of Morsi and the military dictatorship under Sisi. And then a similar turn for the worse in Syria. We'll get to that probably in the Q&A and some of the Q&A with you. So in a way, the summer of 2013 is the first turning point of the counter-revolutionary actors from Russia and Iran. Russia is going to come back more forcefully in September 2015, but Iran is already in with Hezbollah, and then United Arab Emirates and other Gulf autocracies are funding basically anti-democratic militia and coup attempts in various states, Egypt being a central one. So, and then the pendulum starts swinging in the direction of military dictatorships and against these popular movements, at least until 2016, the summer of 2016, right? That would be a kind of, that could be a negative extremity, because what happens in summer of 2016, as this audience, well, many of them would very well know, is the failed coup attempt in Turkey itself, which together to a certain extent with Qatar was the most vocal, has been the most vocal supporter of the Arab uprisings and the government in Tripoli, the Syrian opposition, and many other actors for a very long time, the Egyptian opposition for over a decade, and the elected government. So it came very close to toppling even the Turkish government and instituting a form of military dictatorship. But that's another turning point, right? Because then the pendulum swings again, because after the defeat of the military coup in Ankara, Istanbul, and Turkey more generally, in July 2016, there's a similar attempt to suffocate Qatar in the famous blockade of Qatar by the Gulf Cooperation Council. And again, with the aid of Turkey, the blockade of Qatar is broken, and Qatar doesn't surrender in a way to the Saudi Emirati pressure. And then next year, there is the offensive of Haftar, the warlord in Benghazi, to overthrow the government of General Accord in Tripoli, which is the only remaining revolutionary government in charge of a capital city in the Arab world. And that is also thwarted at the last minute, 25th hour, with significant, again, Turkish military aid and amphibious and otherwise support. And then Haftar has to retreat back to eastern Syria and the Tripoli governments. So that's kind of, again, when the pendulum comes close, and with 3 attempts that failed in Turkey, Qatar, and Tripoli, it starts going back to some another kind of middle point. And then you see the advances of the Syrian opposition, again with Turkish support in the Operation Euphrates Shield 2016, Olive Branch 2018, Operation Peace Spring 2019, and the final push of the Iranian militia, Iranian foreign Shiite militia, and the Russian military-supported Assad regime in the early months of 2020, around February, just around the time of the pandemic. And that offensive is also defeated in the last major battle of the last 4 years. And since then, you know, for the last 4 years, it was more or less stable borders. Frozen conflict, so this kind of modus vivendi is the best way to describe it. Modus vivendi with little pockets of Arab Spring here and there in Libya, in Syria, Qatar, Turkey, and some other allied governments, northern Iraq, etc. administrations. There were those who still harbored some, positive feelings or support for bottom-up democratization, and those who, with either Russian, Iranian, or in some cases American, Emirati for sure, support, tried to suppress these democratic uprisings. I should probably time myself. I will not stop unless you stop me. I'll let you forcefully intervene to stop me if I exceed half an hour by a long march. So when I was preparing the presentation, I was happy to see that I did write the final chapter in a way that it could be delivered, not the entire chapter, don't worry, in the form of a speech summarizing what I learned from these colleagues, almost all of which are fluent in Arabic, have done field work in Arabic-speaking countries. Some of them are Arabs themselves. I neither speak Arabic nor study the Arab world. That's why professionally for me this was also in 2 ways stepping out of my zone. When I look at the collapse of the dictatorships, Ba'athist mostly, in the Arab world, of course, I immediately think of 1989 and the collapse of communist dictatorships from East Germany, Romania, Bulgaria, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, with the end of the Brezhnev Doctrine and the removal of Soviet occupation troops. And that's actually exactly how I commented in 2011 in Turkish opinion columns with lessons from 1989 for the Egyptian revolution of 2011. And then, of course, in the course of 14 years, I could see more clearly what is so different, and that's the international dimension, to be sure, but there are also some domestic dynamics, with the collapse of communism and communist one-party regimes in Eastern Europe and Eurasia versus the perpetuation, resilience of authoritarianism, mostly in the form of military dictatorship in the Arab Middle East and North Africa. Now, this is the final chapter. You can, many of you have already done this, hopefully. Can we do this? I thought I already did. That's feature. Just for your sake, this is where you can basically follow it. This is more or less where we are going to be. Nice tables, and here it is. I'm going to very quickly go over the 8-9 main points here. The inspiration for the title, as I acknowledge in the first sentence, is that late Immanuel Wallerstein, a sociologist associated with world systems theory, has a famous article called French Revolution as a World Historical Event. I assigned it to the comparative graduate seminar and many other courses. It's very good because it's about the origins of social sciences, basically our profession, and many other things in the world. What he says in the article, among many other things, is that the real significance of the French Revolution was not its consequence for France itself, which is debatable, but the terrible fear and hope that it provoked in the elites of Euro-American core, from the British to the Americans to the monarchies of the East and West, and the hope it provoked among the masses of the periphery in the world system's perspective. And then he talks about the uprising in Haiti, the Haitian Revolution, which was suppressed, of course, the uprising in Ireland, and the effort to modernize Egypt under Muhammad Ali of Kabul, as three of these world historical consequences of the revolution. I argue that the anti-authoritarian uprisings in the Middle East and North Africa that started in late 2010, popularly known as the Arab revolutions or the Arab Spring, constitute a similar world historical event of similar, if not greater significance than the French Revolution in the long term, because what happens when hundreds of millions of people, that's, there are 22 members of the Arab League, and many of them have been touched by the Arab Spring, with hundreds of millions of citizens altogether. These hundreds of millions of people who may be considered as global subaltern or the global periphery take up and act on the promises of international hegemonic discourse of democratic emancipation and force the core elites of the North to take a side in their struggle for equality, justice, representation, and popular government. More than a decade after the beginning of the Arab Spring, one can clearly observe that rather than assisting or even remaining neutral in the struggle, most of the great powers or the North and Euro-American core, from Russia to France to United States, we can count some others, have joined forces with the regional nodes of authoritarianism to violently suppress the Arab uprisings, with a mixture of direct military interventions, military coups, and proxy wars. Dispelling, so I'm going to go through 6, 7, depending on how you categorize them, lessons I draw before moving on to the Q&A. To begin with, it dispelled the myth of Western actors as democratizers. It undermined Iran's mythical image and soft power as an allegedly revolutionary Islamic regional actor. It unmasked the Arab elites' hostility to democracy and disregard for Arab self-government across numerous polities, maybe the least surprising of these results. It led to Egypt's loss of its historic status as the center of the Arab world. It securitized and led to the persecution of Arabs in general, but Sunni Muslim Arabs more specifically. It paradoxically and ironically led to the rise of Turkey as a patron of many of the Sunni Arabs in Syria, but also elsewhere. And it disconfirmed, for political scientists, I think at least, the so-called religious political moderation thesis, whereby after revolutions you have to negotiate and share power with the opposition, which was, and Tunisia was seen as the best application of that, and yet it still collapsed into authoritarianism. The attitudes towards anti-authoritarian uprisings across the Arab world served as a critical litmus test for numerous actors within and beyond the Middle East. So its significance is not for Arab world only, of course, is for the Arab world, but also for the Russians, the Turks, the French, the Pakistanis, the Gulf Arabs, the Italians, and so on and so on. Number one, the Great Disillusionment. Is it the failure or the suppression of the Arab Spring? The Arab Spring followed a decade, the 2000s, which was defined by the global war on terror, GLODEM, that targeted mostly Muslim majority countries of the greater Middle East, as well as Muslim minorities worldwide, with the Afghans and Arabs being its most prominent targets. In a bitter irony, the peoples of the greater Middle East, and especially Arabs, were attacked and victimized by foreign powers in the 2000s. Many of us remember the second invasion of Iraq, for not having democratic regimes, George W. Bush's famous goal of spreading democracy to the Middle East. And yet in the 2010s, they were victimized again by many of the same foreign powers for demanding democracy in the course of the Arab Spring. Okay, so I'm going to fast forward. So the Arab Spring and the international coalition that suppressed it finally put to rest the illusion that the Western actors, and especially the United States, despite their imperfections, are ultimately in favor of democratic self-government and against authoritarianism in the Middle East. Many previous episodes of Western-backed restoration of authoritarianism and suppression of democratic aspirations such as the 1953 coup against Mohammad Mossadegh in Iran, were well known, but still sometimes dismissed as aberrations from the otherwise virtuous path of liberal internationalism led by the United States. That actually was my master's thesis in 2003 at the University of Chicago, the CIA engineered coup against Mossadegh in Iran in 1953. And that was the 50th anniversary of that place in 2000. A much more appropriate comparison would be with the anti-totalitarian uprisings that overthrew the communist dictatorships across 6 East European polities in 1989, which I turn to next, and which is a field I know slightly better because it's in a way my area. And that's what came to my mind immediately when I saw the uprisings in 2010, 2001, 11, incidentally also the year I returned to Turkey and to coach 15 years ago. The most significant difference between the two sets of cases, collapse of communist parties from East Germany, Poland down to Romania and Bulgaria, within 6 months in 1989, all of them collapsed within 6 months, middle of 1989 to December 1989 is Ceausescu, Romania. The most significant difference between the two sets of cases appears to be the critical role of external foreign interventions in opposite directions. Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev's decision to abandon the Brezhnev doctrine in the late 1980s was an absolutely necessary precondition for the end of communist dictatorship across East European countries, Bulgaria, Romania, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Poland, and East Germany in 1989. Because without foreign militaries stationed to protect the minority Communist Party dictatorships, all of the Communist parties collapsed and lost power. That did not happen in the Middle East. Egypt, even after the military coup, continued to be the second largest recipient of American military aid, second largest because the first is Israel. Australian generals continued to serve in the Emirates military. The British-American security umbrella for the Gulf continued. And in the case of the largest uprisings, and Syria would be a prime example there was direct military intervention for foreign powers, the Iranian military, the Shiite militias from Afghanistan, Yemen, Iraq, and Lebanon that Iran brought together, and the Russian Air Force and the Navy bombing the Syrian opposition to suppress the Syrian uprising. And as many sources that we also cite point out, the Egyptian military coup was also financed by billions of dollars of Emirati money from the United States. So it wasn't only, and then the east of Euphrates had United States Air Force stationed supporting PYD-YPG, together with French special forces, although fewer in number. So it took 4, depending on how you count, 4, maybe even more, foreign militaries to come in and suppress the Arab uprisings for democracy, quite the opposite of the Eastern European pattern, where international actors financed the transition to democracy, boosted civil society, political parties. In the case of the Arab Middle East, not only that international actors didn't support it, they actively came to suppress uprisings when they actually took place. So that's the biggest difference between the two. So rather than the overthrow of the communist regimes in 1989, the trajectory of the Arab Spring resembles the outcome of the Prague Spring, an interesting, again, similarity in word, where the Czechoslovak attempt to have socialism with a human face under Alexander Dubček was suppressed by the Soviet military intervening and crushing Prague Spring in 1968. So substitute Soviet military, Russian military and Iranian militia and military, instead of Soviet military 68 to Damascus, Latakia, Tartus, Khmeimim, Aleppo in 2015, and then the American Air Force bombing Raqqa and Mosul a few years earlier, then you get a similar story of outside powers suppressing, intervening in the Middle East. So primarily in Syria, so the defeat of the anti-authoritarian uprisings by deploying armed forces included Russia, primarily in Syria, and through proxies in Libya, like Haftar, Iran in Syria, and through its proxies in Iraq and Lebanon, Saudi Arabia in Bahrain and Yemen, and United Arab Emirates in Yemen, but also in Libya. So here I counted for you 5 powers that directly intervene to suppress some of them regional, some of them extra-regional powers to suppress the Arab uprisings. Yeah. Okay, let's see how much time we have.
5 minutes.
5 minutes. Okay, we should fast forward. The vicious seesaw, the collaborative competition between the Western and Russian-Iranian axis, that was the third one. What makes the collaborative competition between these two blocks, the Western and Russian-Iranian axis, particularly destructive and hopeless for the average person is the fact that both blocks opposed even a minimal electoral democracy based on majority rule. Instead, they consistently supported militarized minority dictatorships. Thus, the victory of either side was likely to perpetuate the persecution of the majority, and yet the continuation of the militarized conflict also furthered the suffering of the masses. In the absence of a third force that intervenes to support the majority, the best case scenario is often an immediate ceasefire and cold peace that would result in a frozen conflict. Iraq, Lebanon, Yemen are most likely to be stuck in such a vicious seesaw unless such a resolution is found. Second, the end of the revolutionary myth, Iran as a leading counter-revolutionary force, even in its alleged failure, the Arab Spring transport. So I contest the notion of Arab Spring failing. It didn't fail, it was actively suppressed. It's not as if there was some kind of domestic ontological problem that led to the collapse of the uprisings. They were directly suppressed from above, often by Air Force bombing the civilians. So this naming is important because if you say failure of the Arab Spring, what's wrong with them? Well, there is overwhelming international intervention to make that failure a certainty. One of the most critical transformations relates to the perceptions and the role of Iran in the regional political imaginary. The deep inequalities that the liberal international order regularly generated and perpetuated due to its structural contradictions lead to a large reservoir of systemic resentment. And Iran used to be a key actor that exploited such anti-liberal and illiberal resentment among Muslims in particular. Many Muslims in search of an alternative and a more just international order turned to Iran as a potential model and inspiration. A major consequence of the way in which Arab Spring unfolded in its first decade resulted in the loss of Iran's soft power across the region, particularly among Sunni Muslim populations, but not only them. Iran's intervention in Syria against the Syrian opposition, the participation of Hezbollah, perceived as a pro-Iranian proxy in suppressing the Syrian opposition through the civil war, and the protests in Lebanon in 2019 also tarnished Iran's image, perhaps irretrievably. I'm going to jump over the third one. It's not important. I mean, it's important, but you can read it. The Egyptian turning point. Oh, well, I shouldn't jump over the third one. And in many of these processes, the authoritarian regimes and their international collaborators co-opted minorities to perpetuate a form of dictatorship. I go over that as well. And that almost always served to fragment a larger mainstream opposition. Syria is a good example. Egypt could be another example. We can find other examples along sectarian, ethnic, and religious lines, so that what would be a hegemonic opposition to authoritarian rule is now weaker and weaker because it's split into, Kurdish and Arab, Coptic and Muslim, Shiite and Sunni factions. And thus the authoritarian regimes positions itself allegedly as the protector of whatever is the minority in that situation. Copts in Egypt, Alawites in Syria, Circassians in or Druze in southern Syria or Jordan, etc. And this kind of playbook has manifested itself over and over again. Egyptian turning point is, of course, critical because the trajectory of the failed attempt at democratization in Egypt was seen as synonymous with the Arab Spring itself. And The failure of Arab Spring in Egypt also demonstrated without a doubt the critical role of the triad, also known as the unelected components of government in intellectual or comparative politics, and those are the military, the judiciary, and the bureaucracy. Because having a electoral mandate or majority in the elections, as the original, Egyptian opposition had in 2011, 2012, clearly wasn't enough to have a smooth transition to democracy in the absence of any significant support for the new government among the bureaucrats, the military, the judiciary, or the media. So although these are not actors we usually think about when we think about electoral cycles and democratic consolidation, clearly any government needs to be seen as legitimate and have some minimal support among these unelected components of government to effectively govern. The fourth one, and this is also a very unfortunate development, is that many Egyptian liberals silence, if not open support for the military coup led by General Abdel Fattah al-Sisi that overthrew the government in July 2013, has been critically noted by many observers. Roger Lecroix maintained that liberals hailed him, General al-Sisi, as Egypt's De Gaulle, the only man capable of saving the country from disaster. Fahim Hussein said in his article, Egypt's Liberal Coup, that for the Egyptian liberals, the Muslim Brotherhood, which is half of the electorate, was outside of the nation, so excluding them from the electorate doesn't pose an ideological contradiction for their understanding of liberalism. Much like Catholics in John Locke's famous letter concerning toleration, a classic of liberal theory. Ken Silverstein, in his article on the selling of the Egyptian coup to liberals, also analyzed how the mass killing of Islamists is being justified in America by using ostensibly liberal arguments, and so on and so forth. So Silverstein, and this is a good summary, has argued that we may not like the Muslim Brotherhood, but we can't have democracy in Egypt without it. Just like we can't have democracy in Lebanon without the Hezbollah supporters, or Palestine without any of the Hamas voters. And that is also the argument that Shadi Hamid had made. So in a way, these developments in Lebanon, in Palestine, in Egypt, in Syria, in Libya, in Yemen, force the liberals to kind of decide on the extent to which they side with majority rule, which is a minimum criteria of democracy. Democracy is a lot more than majority rule, but it's at least majority rule. So you can't really have it without having majority rule. And that was an important finding. And this, my 4.4, Egypt is no longer the heart of the Arab world, and that's actually where it relates to here, Istanbul. Egypt has long been considered culturally, demographically, geographically, politically, and symbolically as the heart of the Arab world. And Cairo was the epicenter of a revolutionary phenomenon with the demonstrations in Tahrir Square in 2011. Many others, Benghazi in Egypt, in the Syrian cities, Pearl Roundabout in Bahrain, all look to Tahrir and Cairo for leadership. But with the overthrow of the first and only so far popularly elected government in Egypt, Egypt is no longer the heart of the Arab world, as Bashir Nafi has argued. And The Economist, which I quote later in the article, The Economist had a feature where it said, a century after Turkey lost the Middle East, Istanbul is an Arab capital again. In 2018, Turkey is home to the largest number of Syrian refugees in the world, and Istanbul alone may be home to more than 1 million Arabs, including a former presidential candidate from Egypt, members of the parliament from Kuwait, stripped of their citizenship, former ministers from Yemen, Nobel laureates, and yes, more than 1 million Syrian refugees. And Nawaf El-Kadimi, the Arab publisher speaking to Le Monde Diplomatique in 2021, said Istanbul's Arab communities are more diverse than Cairo's and Beirut's and anywhere else in the Arab. Cairo and Beirut would be the kind of natural hubs for Arab cultural production. So this, again, in an ironic way, positioned Istanbul as the intellectual hub and ferment for the Arab world, which is also, it was also a motivation for me in editing and kind of enthusiastically contributing to this volume because of the historic role that this city, this country, and this society might play in the future evolution of 22 Arab countries. The Tunisian experience is important for my next lesson. I consider the Tunisian experience the nail in the coffin of the political moderation thesis, because there were many theoretical arguments, projections, and indications based on the successful democratization of Tunisia, contrasted with the failed democratization of Egypt, which filled the pages of academic journals that we read and semi-scholarly and popular magazines throughout the 2010s. Just type Tunisia, Egypt. You're gonna get hundreds of hits. You know how Tunisia is the success case and Egypt is the success. And the main thesis is that in those articles is that Rashid Ghannouchi and the Tunisian opposition that came to power was the moderates moderate, and they compromised with Nida Tounes and other secular socialist and leftist opposition as much as they could. They didn't contest the presidency. They shared power at every turn. But despite these and many other signs of political moderation and compromise, the Tunisian president Kais Saied de facto dissolved the parliament in July 2021, and Tunisia is no longer considered democracy and has returned to the authoritarian playbook by every index of democracy and assessment that we've seen in the last couple of years. So if that level of toleration, moderation, and power sharing doesn't work, what possibly can? Because in a way, the Tunisian case was the most likely case of moderation and power sharing, leading to a smoother transition, and yet it didn't. Deriojin is looking at me not very okay. So I'm gonna look. You know, all of it is published. We can take questions, and you are right. We can, because I know that you've prepared excellent questions, which we are going to discuss in the course of this discussion. But as a catch for this presentation, I thought we had another feature that I asked an empirical question about the Arab Spring. And whoever from the in-person audience knows it accurately enough wins an autographed copy of the print book, which is actually very rare. I have it in my backpack. So I have several options. I'll ask the first question if no one answers. We'll have the Q&A, and I'll ask the second question. So that comes in great part from Ali Bakir's chapter that I've also, of course, tried to summarize in my intro. Okay, well, 6 Arab countries' long-time leaders were removed as a result of the first and second waves of the Arab Spring. 6, and these are, you know, leaders that have ruled for a decade, if not decades.
And no cheating, please. So laptops down.
So either tell me 4 of those 6, or tell me 2 from the first wave, 2011, 2012, and just 1 from the second wave, 2018-19. So 6 very long-term leaders of the Arab Spring, 6 different countries, Arab countries. Their leaders were removed directly, immediately as a result of this popular protest. 4 of them in 2011, 2012, the first wave, and another 2 in the second wave. Just give me 4 of those 6, or 2 from the first wave and 1 from the second wave, just 3. Who would like to? Because if you try, you are basically blowing it for next person, because he or she can't repeat the same countries, and then you run out of countries. So, Ismail, you want to try?
Okay, maybe 2 from the first wave, as I remember.
Yeah, 2 from the first wave, but 1 from the second wave. Can you do that?
Maybe I can try for the first wave, because I think I remember.
But you need to get 3.
Okay, I'll
right. Okay.
Husni Mubarak.
Okay, that's great.
And Zeynal Abidin bin Ali.
That's great. What about the second?
For the second wave, I can't recall the specific name.
Okay, well, I have to call on someone else, see if we have a better answer. Does anybody have the other names? What are the other Arab countries that whose leaders were removed as a result of the first or second wave? We have 6 left. Ismail mentioned Egypt and Tunisia. That's good. Okay, well, no one. I'll just
I do see a hand.
Oh, yeah,
Gaddafi.
Gaddafi, that's right.
Democratic leader of Egypt is counts with the second wave leader of.
No, it's the first wave, because that's Mubarak. So I'm asking the 6 dictators who were removed. So Ben Ali, Tunisia, Gaddafi, Libya, Mubarak, Egypt. There are 3 more.
Yes.
It's okay, so it's fine. I should probably mention it since no one is. So there's Yemen. Abu Hadi, yeah, Ali, Ali Ebu Salih, that's second wave. So now it's too much split. I think it would still be probably Ismail because he got the first two. And of course, Algeria, Bouteflika resigned as a result of the second wave. So I mean, so this Q&A is also supposed to be kind of a learning experience in the sense that people say it failed. It failed, but it removed 6 decades long dictators in Egypt, Sudan, Tunisia, Libya, Yemen, and Algeria. What kind of failure is that? I mean, were you expecting 20 leaders all removed within that? That would be extraordinary, especially given the international input to keep them in place. And also notice the geographic. Do you notice a geographic pattern in the leaders that are removed and the ones that are in place? Because Arab world is big, right? It's 22 countries from Mauritania and Somalia all the way to Syria and Iraq. It's the Arab world to Oman and Bahrain, right? Huge. But the ones that are removed, is there any pattern of these 6? Yeah.
So in Tunisia, Egypt, Sudan, they are North African.
And Algeria.
And Algeria.
So they are all North African except for Yemen. So in a way, maybe there's a reason for that. Maybe there's a lot more international investment to keep the autocracies in the Near East in place, and not so much in the case of, Sudan, Tunisia, Yemen, which are more peripheral to the core of the Near East. This is just a speculation. It's not in the book. I'm just, speculating together with you.
But then maybe we can keep the second question
Of
for the
course.
Q&A, and if
Yeah,
you
yeah.
still have a signed copy of the book.
Exactly, exactly. No, I'm going
Okay.
to, and so we'll drop in these questions. I have 2 more
Okay,
in the, and I got this.
Excellent. Thank you so much for the presentation. I do have some questions before we open the floor for a Q&A, so let me proceed to that. I mean, I had the chance to take a quick look at the book. I didn't have a chance to read the entire book, but I mean, thanks to the open access PDF, I actually prepared some questions related to the content of the book as well. But I usually start these GLODEM Book Club talks. Some of you may be familiar with it, with more general thematic questions to the editors or the authors. So the question first is, could you discuss the main challenges that you faced while editing this book, especially given, the perspectives and the dynamic nature of Arab Spring's aftermath?
Well, there were several practical and kind of time and place specific challenges. Well, one, I'm a comparative political scientist, right? And I work on Middle Eastern Europe, Central East Europe, Germany, Russia, and the East. And I speak German and Russian, not Arabic, obviously. So for me, as a kind of outsider, identifying experts of Algeria, Tunisia, Libya, Syria, Egypt, putting them together to have a diverse international group of, from 5 countries, 3 continents with very different backgrounds. That was a bit challenging. And more specific challenge was that this was a time when many people thought Arab Spring is completely dead, that it has turned to Arab winter, and that there is not much to talk about. And that's going to come back. Yeah, you have another follow-up question.
And the follow-up
Yeah,
question was, were there any perspectives or topics you wish you could have included but didn't?
Yes, one of them, it's already in the 1-page preface. I've contacted more women than men as contributors. And initially we had 2, now we have only 1 in the current book. So it's one of the most, I've edited and contributed to many other volumes over the last 15 years. It's one of the most lopsided volumes that I ended up having, but that's not, in part it's structural. As I've said, I have the list, but I can't share it, of course, of scholars who are, so the field might be a bit more, itself might be more. And it was the middle of the pandemic, right? Maybe that was an extra burden. that was asymmetrical. So I would like to include more women as authors. And I would like to include, and I've tried on many occasions, to have Yemen and Egypt. Egypt, because it's so central, it's kind of addressed in the first four intro chapters that have the large overview of Arab Spring, and in my final chapter. But I would have liked to have a specific Egypt chapter as well as a specific Yemen chapter. I couldn't have it. And of course, a big challenge is that, look, I mean, for somewhat obvious reasons, the authors are not residing in those countries, right? And there's a reason for that, right? So that's why we have French, American, Canadian, Turkish, Qatari, etc. authors, but for somewhat obvious reasons, not a scholar from Egypt writing on Egypt. And that's a bit of a challenge. As a Russianist, I understand that challenge, especially now that Russia is under international sanctions and there are all kinds of boycotts and for understandable reasons, and almost zero cooperation with any institutions, academic institutions in Russia. But to have that on a kind of regional scale with more than a dozen Arab countries was also a challenge.
The volume includes contributions from scholars of diverse disciplines also. How did this interdisciplinary approach enhance the narrative of the book, and were there any challenges here also in a way synthesizing these different perspectives?
In terms of content, because it's very enriching for me, I adopted a almost completely hands-off editorship where I didn't, because as a political scientist, I have certain expectations of what the hypothesis, argument, plot, and style is. I refrained from imposing any of that. And that was a bit enriching for me because the chapters I ended up writing also ended up being slightly different than what I usually write. Yeah, we can talk about this for a very long time, but this is all I should say in summary.
I also would like to take a couple of minutes to speak about some forward-looking questions, even though we have spoken about this, how political science usually fails in predicting events overall, we may say, but since we already spoke about like the overall arguments and the topics covered, I mean, going back to the democratic aspirations, could we anticipate another wave of uprisings as some of the contributors in the book suggest?
Yeah, I think we already have, right? And that's kind of what's most pleasantly surprising about the book's production, publication, and the post-publication process, because it was mostly written in 2021, slightly revised and brushed in 2022 and came out. So think of this as a book of the, 2-3 years before. And the fact that it's past, present, and future, and the back cover is a good, and I think, indication of that. We say, although the patterns they observe and the predictions they express may indeed be rather different, they share the belief that the Arab Spring is far from over, with its first decade only a prelude to other major developments to come. Looking at the past, present, and equally important, the future of the Arab Spring, this volume provides reasons for cautious optimism despite broken promises, betrayals, mass suffering, international apathy, and complicity. And this last segment is quite interesting. Just as the catastrophic destruction of the Second World War gave birth to the most impressive scheme of regional integration in Europe, which finds its institutional embodiment in the European Union, one hopes that the current doom and gloom in the aftermath of the first Arab Spring will motivate and enable similar, if not more robust forms of peaceful cooperation, prosperity, and reconstruction in the region. Now, this is extremely optimistic, right? Especially if you look at it from 2-3 years ago. Where everyone said the last pockets of Arab Spring, whether it's the Tripoli government in Libya or Qatar or the Syrian opposition, will be evaporated with an offensive. But if you read our chapters on Libya by Professor Ziad Majid of American University, Paris originally, I don't know his French Lebanese scholar Ömer Özkızılcık, who was on primetime news nonstop for the last two weeks for good reason, because he's an excellent scholar of Syria, all the towns and villages, and my much more modest and short chapter. Our main argument was that the Syrian regime is the equivalent of the South African apartheid regime, that it can only serve, it's actually weaker than that, it can only survive with overwhelming Russian, Iranian, and other foreign support, that its indigenous support is nearly non-existent by now. And that's, in a way, what we saw in the last couple of weeks, that once Russia unplugged its support, and this is something I've mentioned in various occasions, orally and written, since the beginning of the Ukrainian invasion, that Ukraine is immensely more important for Russia than all of Syria. That once Russia is forced to prioritize Ukraine over Syria, and once the Iranian military and the foreign militia that it brought from Afghanistan, Iraq, Yemen, Lebanon are weakened, that the Assad regime is going to collapse. And it's just a matter of time. I'm just impressed and amazed that it happened so quickly, that it was so weakened. But again, I mean, does that count like a second? Yes, I think it does count like it does count as a new wave. And more importantly, if you read Tahir Kılavuz's chapter on Iraq, Algeria, with some references, I think, to Morocco, Tunisia, and Ali Bakir's chapter on where he refers to Sudan, there was a second wave, and the second wave did wash away Bashir in Sudan, and Bouteflika had to concede, and Algeria had a transition. So the Syrian one, which is the most dramatic one in the last couple of weeks, is the third of a second series of waves. And of course, we don't know what's going to happen, but usually once such a tectonic change happens, it has repercussions. It's almost like the aftershocks of the earthquake, that when you have such a dramatic change, it might also provoke pushes for a third Arab Spring elsewhere. So I'd say we could not anticipate this the moment, but I think the prediction that there would be a future, that Arab Spring isn't dead, and that the tens of millions of people who experienced it, especially the young people, and they'll remember this for decades to come, it's going to affect their behavior, choices, political imaginary throughout their life. So there is a lot of reason to think that it's going to come.
I actually did have a question about Assad regime's collapse, but I feel like a lot of questions will be coming from that part in the Q&A, so I'll leave it for now. My last question is going to be about the role of Arab opposition in exile, because this is also briefly mentioned in the book. How do you see this evolving, and what role can diasporic communities play in shaping the future of the Arab world?
Well, now we are fortunate enough that we will observe its immediate application in the coming weeks and months and years. Because the largest diasporic populations were the Syrians in Turkey. They are returning, and they have an opportunity to design new Syria. So we are going to see in action how that plays out. The reason I had the 0.5 or 6, I don't know the numbering, Istanbul as the near Arab capital was exactly that. What role would Egyptian presidential candidates, Kuwaiti MPs, the Syrian opposition, and others living in the imperfect but competitive democratic environment of Turkey, Great Britain, France, what kind of lesson they will then carry back to the homeland when the opportunity avails itself. Again, if I were to make a Soviet comparison is obvious. When Soviet Union collapsed, many Estonians, Latvians, Lithuanians who have been living in the West since the end of the Second World War went back. Some of them got elected president, prime minister, and they led post-communist Baltic republics and others. So this is the closest corollary, but we'll see this in action. We are in the best place to observe that, because Turkey and the Syrian diaspora in Turkey and its contribution to the rebuilding and redesigning of post-war Syria is going to be the first and probably the largest scale application of that. Thank you for this.
Thank you
talk.
so much, Hocam. Well, now we can open the floor for Q&A. I'll be taking questions, 1, 2, 3, okay. We'll
And then
start-
I'll ask you a question for the
Yes.
second.
Yeah, we'll start with you, then Fatima will continue this way, and then the outer circle. Please go ahead.
First of all, I wish to thank you.
What is your name so that I can address you?
Kerem.
Kerem.
First of all, I wish to thank you. It is a true honor to have you here among us, explaining your great work, which, in my humble opinion, is a fresh and rather optimistic take on a subject that has been the topic of many discussions over the years by those much more greater than us. Well, I would like to first begin the Q&A session by addressing the elephant in the room. In light of the recent events that have transpired, and considering the detailed analysis of Syria's revolution in your book, what are the prospects for meaningful governance reform in the country under the current conditions?
Should we collect some questions and then?
Maybe 3 at a time.
Okay.
Okay, 3 at a time and then I'll.
Fatima, and introduce yourself, of course.
Hello, my name is Fatima, and first of all, thank you so much for your presentation, for your speech, for your opinion, and for sharing the book with us, because I think that would be a great opportunity for me to later go over it in greater detail and familiarize myself with other aspects, which I am not so aware of currently. I have 2 questions, but I'm gonna ask one right now. I've noticed a point about like chemical weapons, and I wanted to ask, why do you think the US under President Obama's governance has decided to not intervene in the usage of chemical weapons from the side of Assad's regime? And how has this decision shaped the trajectory of events in Syria today?
I can ask later. I know that
Yeah.
your students have more priority.
No,
I prioritize.
But
there's no priority. I just follow like who raised their hands first, and you, I
it's
think
not
went
related.
through.
I can ask. I wanted to ask a question about the correlation between these events and the recent events in Syria with the events in Russia and after the full-scale invasion. So we see a proxy regime in Syria, which is ruled by minority. We see another proxy regime in Belarus, which is ruled by minority. So we see a conflict. We see the opposition in exile, as Mary Koja mentioned. I have a question. Does this show us some progression, and what will happen in Russia's future domestic politics, in your opinion, as you are the scholar of this field?
Thank you very much. Wonderful question. Fatima, second question, blew my second question, so I can't ask that anymore. It was on the chemical weapons. But yeah. So, because it's an absolutely critical question. No one predicted the collapse of the Soviet Union among political scientists. Almost no one predicted the Iranian Revolution. We didn't predict, I can't speak for the Russia field, we didn't predict the second Russian invasion of February 2022. Even the month before the invasion, there was a Poland overrun with so that's crazy to stay there. I'm saying all of this because you are asking about the future. Political scientists always fail in predicting the future, so why bother? What we can say is to put what has transpired compared to this, right? And of all of these authoritarian Arab regimes, and there are many, most of the 22, when I look and read on the Assad regime, it did always strike me as the one that comes closest to totalitarianism, that reminded me of the Soviet system. Not just the Sednaya prison, even though that's an extremely, it's like Gulag archipelago in Syria.
Like the Lubyanka.
Like Lubyanka, right? So it was, and the responses to it, the disbelief among some true believers, sounds like some inveterate communists who still say they are actually saying terrible things about Stalin. He wasn't so bad, and communism actually has so many benefits, etc. So it's kind of what do you call it? It's a French word. So it just brings back the memories of communism, post-communism.
Déjà vu?
Deja vu, yeah, exactly. It's like the post-communist deja vu. We had this with Stalinism and all of this. So now the Assad regime. So in a way, I find it difficult that anything worse can happen, right? I mean, instead of a totalitarian government, no government or a dozen governments could work. It will depend on who will be the external supporters, for sure. Right? I mean, if you have autocratic founders, it's going to be more autocratic. If you have more competitive, democratic kind of external sponsors, I think they are doing a fine thing without intervening beyond the internationally recognized borders of Syria. That's going to be very important, right? So whenever you had a new regime, it usually was attacked if it was seen as destabilizing the international order, the borders, etc. It's just the first 2 weeks, but they are not saying anything about that. Of course, they claim that Golan Heights are Syrian territory, but that's the international law, and everyone believes that except for Israel. So that's not actually that's not challenging the international status quo, right? So as long as that continues, it's difficult to say because Turkey is the biggest sponsor. So far, I think it will depend on how much United States, European Union, maybe even the Gulf, others are going to fund the reconstruction efforts. The more international stakeholders, the better in a way, because you want to kind of assuage the fears of as many actors as possible when you are rebuilding the country. Yeah, so I said I wouldn't predict the future, and that's for good reason, because political scientists have always failed to predict the future. But to predict the past and to put it in perspective, we could say that, well, Saddam's Iraq is often considered a near totalitarian regime, but that has been gone for over 20 years now. So this was the second closest kind of totalitarian regime in the Arab world. And I think there is a lot of reason to be happy that it's finally gone. And what comes in its place, it's very difficult to be much worse than that. It can be better, but how much better will depend on different stakeholders, including Turkish, Syrian, and others. Fatima's question, that's absolutely the turning point, right? That's the reason I didn't mention it, is because I was going to ask a question about it for the second gift book. But I did say that summer 2013 was the biggest critical negative turning point. The first thing happened was July 2nd, 2013, the military coup in Egypt. And that United States, France, and others very quickly embraced the new military government, and they didn't give any qualms about this. United States didn't even cut the military aid, right, because of the military coup. So that showed that the international community, with very small exceptions like Qatar, Turkey, was on board with the new military restoration. But the second and more violent turning point was August 19, 2013, when Assad regime used chemical weapons in Syria. And despite the fact that Barack Obama said chemical weapons is the red line, United States didn't intervene. Not only that United States didn't intervene, it's actually worse than that, as I discuss in the book. Francois Hollande, the socialist president of France, readied the French Air Force for an intervention because that was already announced as the big red line, and there's going to be an international intervention. And Turkey was ready to intervene as well. So Turkey and France were the most anti-Assad and pro-interventionist countries at the time. And then Obama called Hollande as don't. Right? So not only that US didn't intervene, it actually prevented a potential Turkish, British, intervention from happening. Why it was? I mean, now we have a lot of documentation that they considered the fall of Assad even worse than Assad itself, that they considered Assad as a useful buffer zone between Israel and a majority Sunni Arab state that's emerging. So they preferred a weakened Assad as the best scenario than either a unified Syria under opposition or an Iranian kind of satrapy. So And also consider that just 2 years later, Russian intervention, which was also kind of given a green light, a yellow light, green light by the United States and Israel, because Netanyahu is one of the best friends of Putin. I've written on Russian soft power for Ponas, it's already published in 2019. Netanyahu in the election cycles in the Likud headquarters in Tel Aviv or Jerusalem, there's this huge poster of Putin and Netanyahu shaking hands, hugging, because this is the domestic and international image that they have this strong collaboration. And that, so not only the United States, but Israel also favored Russian intervention in Syria to stop Iranian or Turkish, especially expansion, and to have this Russian plus Assad buffer zone between around Israel. So yeah, I don't know. I think I did answer your question. So many geopolitical factors overlap to prefer Assad or a weakened Assad over alternative scenarios.
Thank you.
Timur's question, you are very welcome, Fatma. Timur's question is great because it also comes to my area of interest. Imagine this. This is the same cycle, right? Bolotnaya protest in Moscow is 2011. That's the year of the Arab Spring. So at the same time that you had the uprisings in Tunisia and Libya and Tahrir Square in Egypt, Russians are protesting in Bolotnaya. Much later, Belarusians will protest. And then Maidan protests in late 2013. And yet, for all the talk about, passivity of the Middle East Arab republics, it was the Arab republics who removed 6 very powerful dictators in 6 major Arab states. And yet Lukashenko is in place, certainly Putin is in place, among some other post-communist states. So again, the international dimension matters enormously, right? I think as long as there is external support, and of course people say this for Georgia as well, Tiflis is up protesting for a very long time with a more pro-Russian government and an anti-Russian or pro-Western opposition for the last couple of weeks, if not months. Again, the international dimension is quite, it's interesting. I mean, in much of the post-communist world, when Russia weighed in against the change was actually stopped, whether in the Caucasus, in Belarus, and elsewhere. It tried to do the same in Syria, and many people said, yes, it also worked in Syria. Russia is the most effective military of counter-revolution, and this is a 2 centuries long theme, right? In the concert of Europe, it was the Russian military that crushed the European Spring of 1848, So Russia is again playing that historic role of crushing revolutionary uprisings in Belarus, Ukraine, Georgia, Syria, right, effectively. But now it's a much weaker Russia. Let's also recognize this is weaker and weaker and weaker. It used to be in Paris and Berlin. Now it's trying to capture and fail. Not even Kiev, not even Kharkiv, right? It's kind of dabbling in Donetsk and Luhansk for the last 2.5 years. Thank you. I don't know if I answered your question, but I tried to. So let's ask another question. In 2019, Turkey signed 2 agreements, one on military cooperation. Turkey signed 2 memorandum of understanding. As soon as you get the answer, you can raise your hand. In 2019, one on military cooperation and one on maritime boundaries delimitation with a friendly Arab government where. So in that,
I mean, I first saw your hand, I think, but I'm not sure if that was because I was looking for
okay, it's like a photo finish.
GNA?
Yeah, that's great. Oh, that's IBOS. Congratulations, IBOS.
May I ask my question?
Yes.
Go ahead, yeah.
So you get the book and a question. Yes.
Yeah.
And the next 3 questions.
We have mentioned the fall of Assad,
Yeah.
collapse of the Assad regime, which is supported by Russia, and they were collapsed by the forces, actors that are supported by Turkey unofficially.
Mhm.
And we know that the war on Russia, Ukraine,
Yeah.
is going to end probably by the means of Trump country election, can we consider possible backlash or the conflict with Turkey and Russia? I mean, since some armistice, Ukraine might end with the Ukraine lost its territory over the Black Sea, and Turkey and Russia become neighboring countries in the Black Sea.
Okay,
John, should we collect two more questions?
yeah,
Okay.
or more if you want. I
You
don't
have
know if
been raising your hand, John.
I know,
I'm sorry, yeah, introduce yourself.
Russian politics. students.
And I wanted to interpret the Ukraine war in the Arab Spring.
Right.
I wanted to see why the answer of the international countries was very different for Arab Spring and for Ukraine war. Because for Ukraine war, there were a lot of economic, political, military intervention. However, in Arab Spring, they didn't really support the democratization policies. They just focused on stabilization policies. And I was interested in what do these differences reveal about the roles of cultural, racial biases and global power dynamics in shaping international policies.
Lots of questions, I know.
Ara, yes. Hocam, first of all, thank you for the book. I think it's a very reader-friendly book too. It's easy to understand. It's a really page turner. And I don't know if you're going to ask this. I don't want to blow up any of your
I
questions.
think I ran out of, I have three.
Ah,
And then
Yeah, but I
The
really
red
like.
line, the logo, and then the 6 meters. Yes.
Okay, that because I really like how you in the book. I read the book. I also read your chapters more detailedly. I really like how you discuss why do we call this Arab Spring anyway, because there's also lack of homogeneous Arabic identity around the protests. There are like ethnic diversities throughout regions. I think this Islamist notion is much more powerful than the Arabic notion. And my question is coming from your chapter, especially chapter 7.
The
In that,
Syria chapter,
yeah,
the Syria chapter, right?
yeah,
The
where-
battle for free Syria. Yes.
exactly. And how you argued that, so you like examine the summer of 2015 Turkey and how PKK initiated repetitive terrorist attacks in Turkey during 2015. And you argue that the decision to launch these attacks was to give YPG an upper hand in Tel Abyad region. And I was wondering, why did you excluded domestic affairs in Turkey, especially 2015 June election, where AKP first time lost its majority in the parliament, and we had a hung parliament during that. There were some can say political instability in the country. Neither AKP, neither CHP were able to form a government. And after that, these repetitive attacks by the PKK, AKP again captured parliamentary majority in November. But in the chapter, you do not mention why PKK decided to initiate these attacks during that summer. I was just wondering, why did you only took domestic affairs? Because I think
I'm gonna pause there because we've had a lot of can I see how many has we had, by the way?
Should
Oh,
I
we
take
have a
all
lot.
of them?
I
Should
mean,
we
it's-
take all of them, 30 seconds each? I'll see how many I
We're
can
just,
answer.
it's up to you. Shall we collect, but
I like this speed Q&A. So
Okay.
Ara, you have 3 minutes. So let's have 30 seconds each
Yes.
for everyone, and I'll see how many I can answer. Is it
Okay.
okay? I got your question. It's very, easy for me. I understood the question very well. So
Okay.
I'll answer that. So those are 3.
So let's have really short
Very short.
questions and let's start with you. Introduce yourself, please.
Yeah, Berat, thank you. When you compare Russia, US, and Iran interventions on Syria, Turkey has conducted its military operations with really minimal civil casualties and minimal destruction on the infrastructure. So when we compare those countries, actually we see Turkey operationally, obvious, I'm not saying Turkey is weak, but when you look at other countries, they're also as good as Turkey's in the terms of operations. So why do you think Turkey has focused specifically on this? Do you think maybe hosting 3.5 million refugees currently, or any other related issues?
Thank you. Yes.
I'm Özge. Thank you for your speech. I wonder what's your take on Israel's shifting place in the Middle East throughout the Arab Spring? Because as far as I remember, in the beginning, Israel was seen as the loser part of the region because of the rising of the Islamist movements, but today is different, so I just wanted to.
Thank you. Yes.
Thank you for your speech and presentation. I really like the conclusions you mentioned in like the chapter 12, but I would really like you to elaborate more on the part where you said like Egypt lost its historical country and now Istanbul is like become the center of Arabs. I would really like to know more about that.
Okay. Thank you. You over there.
Tom, do you think we will observe a final peace between revolutionary and counter-revolutionary movements in Middle East, given the most dramatic theater is over, at least militarily, and the biggest sponsor of revolutionary forces is ready to stand at table with
That's
counter-revolution. Yeah, that's
Okay.
And your name, please?
Fine.
Okay. Sarai.
For your speech. My question is really short and amazing, actually. We read the book in some chapters, Arab Spring effects on leaders, of course, but I wonder that how it affects rich families in the Middle East, actually. Rich families.
Rich families.
Yeah. That's,
Yes.
Yeah, and Ismail, I'll ask about maybe your speculation on the ongoing situation after maybe the peace comes up. What if YPG controlled areas turn into something like Iraqi Kurdish regional government? And do you think that if something like that comes up, Turkey's relations might be resembling that in the future, maybe?
Thank you. If you have time, a second question for Fatima.
I want to ask, how have Turkey's security concerns evolved over time, considering like the current events in Syria?
Extremely short question. Hocam, why using chemical weapons? I mean, Assad was already having superiority and dominance over the poor and crappy opposition forces. Okay, you said the red line.
Sure. I mean, again, why did Saddam use it in Halepче and
We've got 10 minutes left, but
Sure.
I still would like to ask our online
Oh.
participants if they had any questions, and I think there is.
Well, our online audience includes Ferhat Polat, who is an expert on Libya and has written an excellent chapter on Libya. Thank you, Ferhat, for being part of our online audience. Let me read out, because I regret that I haven't read out the list of 13 authors: Professor François Bourga, Professor Richard Falk, Mujib Khan, Ali Bakir, Ziad Mecid, Ömer Özkızılcık, Nur Günay, Ferhat Polat, Tahir Kılavuz, Michael Arnold, İdlir Lika. So I thank you all for these chapters. It's a great pleasure and honor to contribute to this.
Should I read it out loud?
Yeah, sure,
Because
thank
our audience is like listening to the recording later, and might not be able to say it. How do you compare Libya and Syria? And do you think Syria has a chance to avoid the mistakes made in Libya? Asked by Ferhat. Thank you so
Okay,
much.
thank you very much. Great. So I guess 30 seconds or less per question. Okay. Aybars, Ukraine, Russia. We don't know if Trump assuming office is going to end the war immediately. I doubt it, because even if Trump wants it, the foreign ministers, the Secretary of Defense, Secretary of State, and other appointees that he's bringing in are going to bring the regular State Department, Pentagon opinion. And they are not, I mean, they are going to want to negotiate a Ukrainian victory over Russia, which Russia won't accept, right? So I'm not sure if it's going to end with the negotiation table. It might end with a military victory on either side. The closest comparison I made since the beginning of the war was that it is more likely to be like the Winter War that the Soviet Union had, Stalin against Finland. The Soviet Union did capture Karelia, it's still a Finnish region under Soviet, but they failed to subdue Helsinki government. Finland didn't become Soviet or socialist or etc. And I find it ironic that we talk about Finlandization of Ukraine. I think Russia successfully Finlandized Ukraine in the way that it didn't intend, that it became very nationalistic, mobilized, anti-Russian, but the remainder of Ukraine, the 75%, 80%. And so I'm still anticipating a military resolution, not a diplomatic negotiated one, and that will be a result of exhaustion on both sides. Whether that would lead to a clash with, Turkey, because I mean, everyone, Russian-Turkish war, right? That's the history. We had 7 wars, 8 wars. But there would still not be a land border, right? For me, always Georgia is far, far more important than any other country, Kyrgyzstan, because that's the buffer state, right? As long as we have an independent sovereign Georgia, which is actually quite friendly to Turkey, although it's also friendly to Russia, the prospect of hot war is still not that close. Yes, from our campus, we are looking to Sevastopol, and the Russian Navy might bomb us. I hope not. But that's more difficult amphibious landing than the land border. So I'm going to be faster. Einar. Yeah, I mean, is it cultural, racial, religious? Of course, our default position is to say that it is. But at the same time, remember that the Western alliance didn't stand up for Ukraine in 2014. Despite the fact that they signed the Budapest Memorandum, right? Despite the fact that the British and the Americans guaranteed Ukraine's territorial integrity in return for Ukraine surrendering its nuclear weapons. And even then, they didn't deploy British, American, Turkish, NATO troops to deter Russian occupation and annexation of Crimea in 2014, or Donetsk and Luhansk again in 2014-15. Until Russia crossed some kind of red lines with the occupation of the rest of Ukraine. So I wouldn't bet on Ukraine counting as a white Christian Western nation, not so much. I don't think it's, there is that dimension slightly with the refugee reception, but even then, where are the Ukrainian refugees? Millions of them. What is the Ukrainian equivalent of Turkey? It's Poland, right? The largest, and that's historically the most connected country with Ukraine. So I don't think there is such a strong Western favoritism. I just see it in more geopolitical terms. Of course, it makes sense to, provide billions of dollars of military aid to Ukraine because it's going to drain the Russian military in a war of attrition for years. Russia no longer counts as second great military power in the world. It's who knows whether it won't be counting the third military power in a couple of years. It has been severely weakened by the war. So I think if geopolitical explanation works, the military explanation, I don't look at the other explanations. And in the case of Ukraine one, it still seems to work, I think, Aram. Page Turner, thank you very much. We did it in a way as a public service, so slightly, semi-popular, semi-academic. I'm glad. I have an entire piece called, it was published in 2016. Why did the PKK declare People's Revolutionary War in July 2015? I go over the 4 hypotheses, including the one you mentioned, domestic explanation. And I just don't find it convincing because it was the PKK who first announced that it's launching what it calls People's Revolutionary War in its own newspaper, in its own, official channels, before the coalition negotiations between the parties in the Turkish parliament happened. They had a kind of interregnum government where 2 of the ministers were from HDP. So, HDP had the closest it came to a share in the government, and yet PKK still declared this offensive. That's why I find the Syria explanation more convincing, that PKK wanted to keep the Turkish military, security, and public busy with internal war, suicide bombers in Istanbul, Bursa, Ankara for an entire year from July 2015 to 2016, while it was occupying Tel Abyad and Ras Ul Ain, all of these Arab cities, and consolidating its control with American Air Force, of course, support in eastern Syria. So I think it was a ploy to keep the Turkish military and society busy with conflict within Turkey so that it can't intervene in Syria, and that's exactly what happened. Only after the failed military coup, actually even 3 years after that, Operation Olive Branch, Zeytin Dalı could be launched against PYG. But I have an entire piece. It's called "Why Did the PKK Launch War?" It's in English, Berat. The biggest difference, if you look at that chapter, and several of you have read, Turkey in Syria versus Iran, United States, and France in Syria, is that people said, okay, well, these polls are not trustworthy, maybe not. But you look at the polls to the extent that Gallup International was able to take in Syria, there is a light year of difference between how much the Syrian public supports Turkey. For example, graph number 1, page 212. 55% of Syrians think Turkey is having a positive influence, as opposed to 6% for Iran, 10% for United States, and 40% for Russia. That has been my main thesis from the beginning, that Turkey, for some reason, and it's a good reason, I think, sided with majority rule and the great majority of the Syrian public. Whereas the Iranians and the Russians and the French and the Americans betted on very tiny ethnic and sectarian ideological minorities. Socialist Marxist minority within the Kurdish minority, which itself is 10%, and think of the socialist Marxist minority within the 10% minority. And the Baathist socialist minority within the 12% Alawite minority, which again is in the single digits. And I thought this is structurally unsustainable. No matter how much you militarize that minority, you can't govern a country relying on 4 or 5% of the population. Turkey didn't side with Turkmens or some kind of ethnic minority. If it said, okay, let's annex the Turkmenda, we'll still have Hatay, that would have been it directly said, the majority, which is Sunni Arab majority, that's 60%. We are going to intervene on them in a situation where the Saudis or the Emiratis or any Arab power wasn't stepping in for the Arab majority. That's the irony, right? How Istanbul becomes the capital and Turkey ironically becomes the patron or supporter of the Arab majority. That gave Turkey a big demographic political advantage. And that also explains, I think, in great part why the operations could be done with minimal civilian casualties, because they had popular support. Because many Syrians joined the Free Syrian Army and the Turkish support groups in a way they didn't for the Iranians, Americans, and of course with Americans and Russians, they are coming with air force and bombing from above, and they are not even interacting with it. I mean, they are not coming into Syria to govern it. I mean, they are coming into Syria like colonial powers, go in and out. Belgium coming to Congo and leave, right? I mean, it's a completely foreign land that they can completely destroy and go back. Özge, Israel's place is extremely central. I mean, Israel was extremely threatened by the double revolution in Egypt and then Syria. Imagine if there was a popularly elected government in Egypt, let alone one in Syria, could Israel do what it did in West Bank in 2016, 17, 18, all the way up to basically the Gaza war now? There is no way. It would fear that there would be an Egyptian and or Syrian intervention to stop Israel from doing it. But because Egypt basically got completely stuck with its own, internal military coup and suppressing its own civilian population, and Syria likewise, Israel had a free hand. In fact, I think the basically final elimination of the Palestinian people as a people, an entity, was the last stage in the suppression of the Arab Spring. I think once all of them were knocked out and Israel normalized relations with the Emirates and Bahrain, and it was on the brink of normalizing with Saudi Arabia, Right? Basically, they reason that, okay, there are no more Palestinian people. We've normalized with everyone. No one is going to help them anyways. Let's have the final kind of law. And yet they miscalculate, I think. That's the thing with, I mean, in my Turkish op-eds too, I always think of Ukrainians, Free Syrians, Palestinians, right? They are in each case and at the same time, at present, battling against extraordinary military political adversaries, right? Russian military is far more better equipped and powerful than the Ukrainian. Israel is immensely more powerful than the Palestinian resistance. And the Syrian opposition was far, far less equipped than the Russian, Iranian, Assad military. And yet, they couldn't win the decisive victory. Again, that goes to show that, don't just look at the numbers. The resolve also matters. The Ukrainians are fighting for their homeland as Palestinians and the Syrian opposition. So the Syrian case is the most dramatic one when, it erupted in a couple of years. I'm not saying the same will happen with Ukraine, let alone with Palestine, which is the most difficult. But Israel's place was central. And I think the genocidal assault in Gaza in the last year would have been the last stage in the suppression of Arab aspiration for self-government. So I think it is, and now, yeah, thank you. And that was very important, of course. It's a big question. I mean, yes, Istanbul as a center for, that's also one reason I wanted to, we don't have many Arabs in the audience, but I really would want the book to reach more than the Turkish audience, to the Arabic diaspora in Istanbul and beyond. But I won't say anything more because we don't have time. For a final piece, well, Turkey was hesitant, right? And the little bit of information we have about the last couple of weeks also says that the opposition wanted to have the assault as early as September, whereas the Turkish interlocutor says, stop, don't do it. Let's just wait another 4 weeks, 5 weeks, 6 weeks. Let's see if we can negotiate. We don't know why they waited. Maybe they waited for American election results because that's November, right? Maybe they waited for something else. But we know that, Turkey sought a modus vivendi. It wanted exactly what you were saying. Okay, so, we couldn't change governments. We are not powerful. It's true. I mean, Turkey versus, half a dozen countries, it's very asymmetrical. So let's just keep the northwestern Free Syria, the Tripoli government, Qatar, and let's just reach a kind of frozen peace or kind of modus vivendi. Now, of course, the Turkish, Syrian, Qatari, Libyan side is in a much better position because you have an entire country, more or less, Syria, that has changed sides. Maybe it could seek that, but that's speculation, and I don't want to say it will definitely happen. Sarai, going off of the French Revolution metaphor with which I wrote the final chapter, I'd say that any revolutionary uprising is horrifying for the elites, everyone. And I think that was the case with the Arab Spring, and that's why the Gulf in particular reacted particularly, negatively to the prospect of popular self-government, in great part because of also the huge income inequality between a very wealthy, tiny Emirates in the Gulf, and then several 100 million Arabs who don't have these natural resources. And that's one of the promises of the Arab Spring. And someone said, why Arab Spring? Exactly. It's not an Arab Spring, François Bourga says it, and I pick it up in there was nothing Arab nationalist or ethno-nationalist or ethnic about the spring. It was multi-ethnic, it was multi-religious, right? So actually calling it Arab Spring is a misnomer, but because it's popularly, we also picked that title, but actually it's not. It's a disconfirmation, it's a repudiation of the Arab socialist kind of ethno-nationalist ideologies of the past. It's much more pluralistic and diverse. But revolutions, yes, they usually throw elites into panic. And that was the Wallerstein thesis, why we have social sciences institutionalized with the French Revolution, because the elites wanted to understand and control and regulate social change. Once they saw what happened with the French Revolution, they wanted to make sure that it never happens again, or if it happens under elite tutelage and kind of. So in that sense, yes, I'd say probably. I don't know how much, for example, there was wealth flight from the region, for example. That would be one sign, right? We see how the Russian oligarchs are behaving in a time of war and instability. I didn't look into how the rich Arab families in the Gulf and elsewhere behaved during the Arab Spring.
About that,
Very quick.
yesterday there was an article in Financial Times. I just saw it while I was looking at my phone. Preparing, Assad dispatched 250 million of Syria's cash to Moscow. So that just goes to show even this is just the tip of the iceberg, what comes out.
It probably is.
Newspapers.
That's millions of dollars. I mean, even for
250
Ali
million.
Abu Salih, they said billions of dollars, and that's Yemen. Right? So, thank you, Kerem. YPG versus Iraqi Kurdistan. The Arab Spring, but also many of the battles before that, are also battles for a vision of different visions of Kurdishness. Kurdishness within Turkey, Kurdishness within the Kurdistan regional government in Iraq, the Erbil versus Süleymaniye version versus Kamışlı. And it's very clear since the time of Turgut Özal through the present day, 30, 40 years, that the Turkish government's preference is to work with the Kurdistan regional government of Erbil and, Bars. This is one version of Kurdishness that is seen as compatible. Turkey has been the largest investor in building Iraqi Kurdistan since its founding. So I would think among the scenarios that we mentioned, and Neçivan Barzani and others have already said things to that effect, the foreign minister Hakan Fidan also said something to this effect, that we have no problem with Kurds and their representation, we have a problem with YPG. It wouldn't surprise me if somehow, a version of the Kurdistan regional government Syrian branch would be Turkish interlocutor to kind of marginalize and eliminate YPG, PYD, and other cultures. So I don't see why Turkey wouldn't reach an agreement with Erbil and its versions. That's completely doable, but probably not with YPG. Not probably, almost certainly not. Yeah, Turkey's security concerns have, Fatima, 2015, 2016, which we mentioned in relation to Ara's question, and then the failed military coup. For example, it's so dramatic. Between July 2015, the PKK starting its largest terrorist campaign of the last 15, 20 years, and July 2016, the failed military coup, Turkey was completely obsessed with internal security threats, right? PKK and the Gülenists and the military coup. So any external threat, Georgia, Crimea annexation, Ossetia, Russian military in Aleppo being captured, those take the backseat, the second the second, third order threats. Now I saw it in social media. It does make sense. They were saying, before Israel reached Turkish border, we reached Israel with the Syrian revolution. Right, you have Turkish intelligence and many other advisors, basically, facing Golan Heights. So, and this was so since the end of the Cold War. I remember this is not even like 20 plus years. Many governments before, when General Kıvırkoğlu was chief of staff, right? This is like 1990s. So, some of the Turkish military doctrine, they said we have to move to forward defense, right, to meet the threats and challenges outside of our borders, and that's actually that's happened, right? I'm not saying this was all very well crafted 25 years ago and it has been implemented, but that's where it is, basically external. And Ferhat's question is excellent. Well, I mean, Aybars, why chemical weapons? Again, Saddam could have suppressed the Kurdish rebellion without a genocidal massacre in Halep with chemical weapons, and yet he used it. Putin says, I'm going to use tactical nuclear weapons. It's not going to win the war, but he might still use it. Americans dropped the atomic bomb in. Why did they have to drop in Nagasaki? They already dropped it in Hiroshima. It's very clear that you can do it. Why do it a second time? And yet they did it. So I wouldn't attribute so much rationality into, some of it is demonstration effect. Like I can do it, right? I can do it again. So as I've said, right, no one has put Truman or the chief of staff for Nagasaki on trial, right? Why do it a second time, etc. So I wouldn't attribute so much military strategy to that. Perhaps Syria and Libya, the greatest, I try to think, the places that the British, for example, decolonized. India, right? Pakistan, India, partition, Kashmir, Hyderabad. Same time, Palestine, Arab Jewish, almost, a decade later, Cyprus, Turkish Greek. What made the big difference is that, for example, Cypriot Turks had a big external backer. The Turkish military went in and secured a third of the island for the Turkish Cypriots. Palestinians didn't have such a strong backer. I mean, there were 4 Arab-Israeli wars, the Jordanian and Syrian army, but none of them was as strong enough as in the case of the Turkish intervention to secure a Palestinian state. And we could say the same for Hyderabad or Kashmir, which came under Indian rule, although they could have been Pakistani or independent Muslim. Why am I saying this in relation to Farhad's question on Libya and Syria? Syria is directly bordering Turkey. That's a big advantage. It's actually more surprising that Turkey could intervene in Libya, despite the fact that it's across the Mediterranean. Like it's extremely difficult to project military power across large seas with amphibious landing. So that's why many people have said, and correctly, that for Turkey to be involved in Nagorno-Karabakh, maybe in Syria, that's natural, but to project power to Tripoli, to Trablusgarp, Libya, that's basically the stretch of Turkish power. That's they are kind of testing the limits of Turkish military power. And I agree with that. I mean, even though the Turkish state, military, political, economic, is backing the Tripoli government, the UN recognized government of national accord, and now the Damascus government in the making, Syria could be more advantageous in the sense that its outside backer ally is next door and might achieve better outcomes in a time of crisis. Whereas it would be more difficult for Turkey to help Libya. But then again, Ferhat Hocam, you are the expert on Libya, so you are putting me in a difficult position by asking a question on Libya. You know the answer better. Thank you for your patience, for your thought-provoking questions.
Any last words that you would want to?
Oh, well, keep up the hope. Political scientists mispredict. Look at how many people predicted full Russian occupation of Ukraine 2.5 years ago. They couldn't even capture Kharkiv, let alone Kiev. So until a war starts, no one actually knows the result, right? We put up the numbers and military strategists do that. Well, they have 2.5 times more tanks and they don't have missiles. This one has air force. And then you look at the war. I mean, Afghan war is an incredible, of course, manifestation of this over 25 years against both superpowers, first the Soviets and then the Americans. But that's extreme. And Vietnam, Ho Chi Minh, Algeria, etc. So resolve is important as well. Ukrainians, the Palestinians, and Syrians are fighting for their homeland. So outside intervention only goes so far, right? It's always secondary. Whoever is motivated to hold on to their homeland, they have an advantage over others. I try to end in an optimistic note. I don't know if that was an optimistic one.
Thank you so much again.
It was really engaging discussion, and I also would like to thank our online participants and our wonderful audience for their really interesting questions and their engagement with the discussion. And with that, let me actually stop here.